this talk is going to go very quickly through some of the main questions we might have about playing Bach's organ chorale preludes. So some of the questions we're going to look at include editions, articulation and fingering, pedaling, ornamentation, kinds of organ and registration, and tempo, and maybe we'll get along to drawing some general conclusions along the way. We'll see where we get to. But before we get going with all that, we can just very quickly ask, what are chorale preludes? What were they used for? We notice that in Bach's compositions, more than half of his organ compositions are in the form of chorale preludes. Why did he write so many? Well, to answer that question, we need to understand that Bach was, for most of his life, a church musician, and he wrote largely music which he needed in connection either with his job or with teaching other church musicians. One of the main tasks of a Lutheran church musician was, and still is today, playing the organ for services. And in that connection, hymns were, and still are, introduced by a chorale prelude. This tends to be a short chorale prelude for most of the hymns, but a rather longer one for the opening hymn. So one of the purposes, at least, of chorale preludes is exactly that, is introducing hymns. Most organists improvised their own chorale preludes to hymns. Using written out ones was rather looked down upon. But in the case of, for example, Ornaments, the purpose of that collection is, as much as anything else, to teach church musicians how to create, whether it be improvise or compose, their own chorale preludes, as well as, of course, performing them, as playing them. The longer chorale preludes may well have been either the introduction to the first hymn, in other words, the longer introduction to the service as a whole, or have had some other liturgical purpose. But in any event, in every case, the hymn is absolutely central to the chorale prelude. The chorale prelude can't exist without the hymn itself. And that's why we absolutely have to understand the chorale melody before we start playing the chorale prelude. Because anybody that was listening to it would have recognized the hymn tune itself from the chorale. And we also have to understand the text, because that supplies the whole ethos of the piece. It's hard to overstate the extent to which ordinary people in Bach's day knew these hymns. They knew them inside out, and quite often we find that particularly emotive sections of the chorale prelude correspond to emotive sections of the hymn text, and people would actually have been aware of that because they would have been following the text through in their minds as they listened to the hymn tune itself. So the hymn tune and the chorale itself, the text of the chorale, is absolutely central to an understanding of the chorale prelude. A good tip is to sing the chorale melody to yourself while you're playing the chorale prelude, quietly, of course, silently. That helps you to focus on the lines of the chorale melody. It also helps to breathe between the phrases. When we're singing a vocal line, we take a better breath after a long line of text than after a short line, because we need the breath. And that is a good practice also when playing. As a general rule of thumb, at the end of a chorale line, if it's notated in minims, for example, we would make a dotted crotchet and then a quaver rest to mark the end of the chorale line. But that does adjust a little bit depending on the circumstances. It is, however, always a good idea to write it into the score, and preferably to tie it in with something else which is happening, just in order to have less things to think about at the time So the next section is concerned with what are the right notes and is there any difference between editions? We all want to play the right notes. It's a very important thing. But do different editions, for example, make any real difference in the real world? Well, there's all kinds of differences, and we'll just have a quick look at a few of them here. So it has to be said straight away that the notes are going to be largely the same, irrespective of which edition you use. Some editions are more prone to errors than others, some have consulted better sources than others, and some have made better editorial decisions than others. What I mean by that last one is that sometimes the manuscript is unclear, or there is an obvious error in it, or there's a smudge or damage, or some other reason why the editor has to sit and decide what the manuscript is trying to actually say. And some editors are better than others at doing that. But in the real world, unless you're recording a CD or you're doing something which for some reason has to be authoritative, then there is not going to be a massive difference between the notes from one edition to the next. Now, of course, an editor also has to decide which works are actually by Johann Sebastian Bach and which are not, but that's an entirely different question which we haven't got time to look at here. There are probably two things which are most important for everyday use, the kinds of things which are going to affect the way in which we use an edition. So the first of these is, does the editor actually get in the way? And what I mean by that is if the editor has added fingering, has added phrasing, has added tempo markings for more than the 6 or 7 chorale preludes that Bach wrote, which actually have tempo markings on them, or a host of other editorial comments. These are figments of the editor's imagination, and they're going to get in the way of what you're doing. The fingering is likely to be romantic piano fingering, we'll talk about that later. The phrasing is obviously going to be romantic phrasing, we'll talk about that later as well. Pedalling, if he's written in pedalling, is going to be 19th century pedalling style, and we'll talk about that too. And other unnecessary material which you may not want. All these things are going to try to force you to play in a way that you might not want to play, and almost certainly which will not be how we currently understand Bach's music to have been played. The other question is, what does it look like on the page? That may sound very trivial, but it is actually quite important. Is the page cluttered, as it will be if the editor has added a whole load of rubbish? Or is it very clean and easy to see and good, plenty of space to write in your own comments and your own markings? Are the page turns convenient? Is the volume itself well made? Is it going to stand up to the wear and tear that you're going to give it? All these things may seem a little bit trivial, but if you've ever had that experience of learning a piece from one edition and then trying to play it from a different edition, you'll know just how much we come to depend on the way in which the music is laid out, and just how psychologically important it is to us to have the music in one particular way. So a clean edition promotes clean playing. Most organists have their favourite editions of Bach's works. I usually use Bernreiter's Neue Bach-Ausgabe, not because it's perfect, because it isn't. It has more misprints than one would wish, and there are times when the editorial decisions I really disagree with. But the reason that I like it is that it is well made, it looks good on the page, it's very clean, and also it was the latest thing when I was a student, and that promotes a kind of loyalty which stays with you. I think once you get used to a particular edition, you tend to stick with it. A lot of people like Walter Emery's Novello edition, especially for Orgelbüchlein. And that was an admirable edition, even though it contains rather more of the kind of editorial comment than one would wish for nowadays. Nonetheless, the late Walter Emery was a wonderful editor, and in many of the cases where he differs, for example, from Bärenreiter's editors, I find myself constantly agreeing with him. So he has a very good and reliable text. But there are lots of other editions as well, and I'm sure you have your own favourite. But I would just urge you that if you have an edition with fingering and phrasing and pedalling marks, that edition should head towards the recycling, if at all possible. In the end, you're going to end up with an edition that you're comfortable with. It won't be perfect, nothing ever is, but a good edition is one which enables and empowers. But the edition itself isn't the whole answer, because sometimes it's perfectly clear what Bach has actually written on the page, and equally clear that it's not what he wanted or that it's wrong. And in those circumstances, an editor really has no right to interfere, and it's something which we actually need to think about ourselves. I'll give you 3 completely different examples of some of the kinds of issues that are raised here. So the first one, if we look at Ich ruft dir from the Orgelbüchlein, we'll notice that the chorale melody is heavily decorated for the first 5 bars, but completely plain for the rest, until the penultimate bar. Now, why is that? Why would Bach do something like that? Well, if we look at the manuscript, we can see that after 5 bars, it became apparent to Bach that he was running out of space on the page, and so he squashes everything up. So there's no space for decoration. And by the time he gets to the penultimate bar, he gives up trying to get everything onto the page and runs over onto the next page. So we suddenly get the decoration back again, because at that point, he's suddenly got loads of room. There's an entirely different kind of problem here in the slow movement of the Bach-Vivaldi A minor concerto. I know that's not a chorale prelude, but it's the easiest example which comes to mind of this kind of issue. If we look at bars 26 to 28 and then compare them with bars 15 to 18, we notice that there is a little difference. It would have been much more satisfactory in bar 28 to go up to a D rather than the rather clumsy workaround that we get. So what on earth was Bach playing at? Well, the answer is that his keyboard only went up to a C. A modern keyboard, though, can play the D that he so obviously would have wanted. So what do? Well, the obvious answer is we play the D. My third situation, which I want to look at briefly, is rhythmic oddities and notation itself. You know that a couple of 100 years ago, people used to not bother as much as we do now about spelling. So sometimes in books you get the same word spelt differently 2 or 3 times in a sentence. And names too in documents are spelt in a whole variety of ways, and nobody really seemed to have bothered about it. It's a bit the same with musical notation, that we tend to be very hung up in getting everything notated very precisely and getting all the maths to add up. And in the 18th century and before, people weren't quite so bothered about that because there was a general understanding that that lines up with that. You understood from the context what the music should be saying, and you did it. And it didn't matter if not all of the numbers added up precisely. So in this case here, we look at Komm Gott Schöpfer Heiliger Geist from the Orgelbüchlein and the Leipzig 18 chorales. Here in bar 3, it just doesn't add up. So the convention here was simply that you understand what to line up with what, and you just do it. The maths, as I say, didn't matter. But it all makes a bit of a mess of an edition. And that, incidentally, is one of the places where the late Walter Emery did a much better job of presenting it sensibly than the Bärenreiter editions. So the next point is articulation and fingering. A question which you often hear is, should we be using thumbs? And a quick spoiler, the answer is yes, we should be using thumbs, but we'll come back to that precisely why. But should we be using what is often termed authentic fingering? I'm sure that you've heard that and you've perhaps worried about it at some point. Should we be using authentic fingering? The quick answer to that one is that there is no such thing as authentic fingering. There were a whole variety of fingering systems in use during the 18th century. Bach was probably inconsistent from one day to the next, and undoubtedly he changed his practice during the course of his lifetime. But we can still refer to suitable fingering or appropriate fingering and look a little bit at that. So what is appropriate fingering in an 18th century context? To understand that, it's probably easier to look a little bit ahead in time to the period where fingering practices were changing. There was a terribly interesting period in the 1820s, 30s, where two different fingering systems were in use at the same time. Those organists who held to a traditional view, who were, well, I hesitate to say that organists tend to be old-fashioned, but those organists who were rather old-fashioned tended to use the 18th century, the traditional fingering methods, while those who went for a newer approach used the fingerings which were developed for piano music and were being codified by Czerny and other theorists at the time. And so we can see very clearly the difference between those two systems, and they were commented on by theorists who actually referred to them at that time as the old way and the new way. So what really is the difference between the two? Well, the simple explanation is that the old system of fingering puts the strong fingers on the strong beats. And that's a really good idea if you're thinking in terms of articulation. You want to highlight the primacy of the beat. Great, you put the strong finger on the beat themselves. That's as much a psychological thing as anything else, but you don't need necessarily to ensure legato between the beats. So you can simply move your hand position basically from the one beat to the next. This preoccupation with the beat itself is the reason why Baroque music plays so often with disruptions of the beat, with hemiolas and so on, because the beat is so strongly established. Even right at the end of the 18th century, when a new melodic emphasis was beginning to show, theorists like Heinrich Christian Koch in his Musikalisches Lexikon, right at the end of the century, says that the beat still has primacy. So it's very exceptional to slur across the beat, for example, and that is usually going to sound out of place. The new system of fingering, by contrast, is concerned with developing long melodic lines and with ensuring a legato which carries over changes in hand position. And for that purpose, the new system was developed of passing the thumb under the third finger or the third finger over the thumb on the way down, which ensures this sense of long legato line. So as a principle, these two systems of fingering are not alternative approaches to achieve the same end. They are systems which are designed for completely different purposes. I said in the introduction, incidentally, that we're going to use thumbs irrespective of what kind of fingering we use. Even in all the 18th century fingering systems, the thumb was used at the beginnings or the ends of scales and in stretches and in chords. So the idea of not using thumbs is a bit of a red herring. There is no system of fingering which never uses thumbs. But the difference between them is what the thumb is actually used for. As I say, the difference is whether or not it's used to change hand positions. So how was this fingering actually achieved? As I say, there were lots of different systems. We haven't got time to go into them all just now. You can go away and read up on them. But essentially, if you think about a scale going up, you can play it alternating between the third and fourth fingers, which will achieve a pairing of notes. Dee-dum, bum, 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 bum. That doesn't mean, incidentally, that the 18th century fingering style is going to result in lumpy playing. It's not going to be dee-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum, any more than a 19th century pianistic fingering will give you thirds and fourths. Both can achieve a legato, but they are looking rather differently and feeding into your playing in a rather different way about where the pulse accents lie and whether or not they are highlighted. As I say, there were lots of different traditions even in Germany, and if we look at Europe as a whole, there were even more traditions there. One of the most interesting ones, incidentally, is France, where we can see that this preoccupation with the beat and with the strong finger on the beat is allowed to warp the very rhythm very slightly, so we get a slight dwelling on the beats notes. Dee-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum. This is termed inégalité. And in an unequal note length, where the on-the-beat notes tend to just come fractionally longer than the off-the-beat notes. That's a kind of technique which Bach would have been familiar with, but which is quite inapplicable in German music of the time. The question we haven't asked is whether we should actually be using an authentic fingering system. As I say, that's not quite such a simple question because there isn't any one authentic fingering system. But it's also a difficult question in another way. I suppose there are two opposing arguments. The one argument says that playing with an authentic 18th century fingering system will help us better to understand the ebb and flow of the music, the articulation of the music. It will force us to think in a particular way, and therefore it's going to improve our playing. The other opposing view says we have learnt from childhood to play in a particular style of fingering. If we try to alter that and play in a completely different way, we are then going to be playing artificially. We're going to be imposing something which is extraneous to ourselves onto the music, and therefore we're going to be playing, in a sense, inauthentically because it's not what comes naturally to us. If we can manage to play with an appropriate articulation and not to be influenced by the possibilities of the phrasing of 19th century piano music, then we should be able to play appropriately using modern fingering. Well, that's two different ways of looking at the question, and you can take your pick. Whichever you choose, there are those two important things to bear in mind. The one is phrasing and the other one is legato. Phrasing itself is a 19th century terminology. It's not something which was thought of in those terms in the 18th century. Even in the age of Mendelssohn, the term phrasing wasn't actually in use and long phrasing marks weren't used. Everything is concerned with articulation. Phrasing itself is appropriate to think of in terms of the chorale melody in a chorale prelude, of getting the lines of the chorale to reflect in the chorale prelude itself. Even there, the concept itself of phrasing is not an 18th century one. The other one is legato. Legato itself is a 19th century ideal, not an 18th century ideal. And therefore, if you've not got long phrasing marks indicating legato phrases in your music, then that's a good thing. It's not something you should be worrying about. Standard 18th century articulation is often referred to as a varied or differentiated non-legato. In other words, not detached, but not actually legato either. So strings of semiquavers will often heighten the emphasis on the first pair at the expense of the rest. Is a very typical kind of articulation, or in slower music. So this almost but not quite detached kind of playing is going to heighten the rhythmic vitality of the music itself. If you decide to use modern fingering and yet play with an appropriate articulation, you will often find, in fact, that the fingering begins to diverge rather from the 19th century practice. You'll find yourself actually starting to put stronger fingers on the stronger beats and moving your hand between beats, because that really comes naturally as you start to place a stronger beat. And whichever fingering system you use, that's really quite a healthy way of thinking about articulation. So let's just move on now to pedals. And here there's something rather similar. Again, there is a question which is often asked: was there a rule that you can only use your toes? And the answer is, well, it depends what you mean by a rule. Well, there seems to be no doubt that the standard go-to method of pressing a pedal was with your toes. How do we know that? Because obviously there isn't really a lot of documentation about it. Nobody bothered to say play with your toes any more than anybody would say nowadays play with your fingers on the keyboard. It's so obvious we don't need to say it. And similarly, in the 18th century, it was to a large extent taken for granted that that is what you would do, and so people don't write about it. But there are probably three ways in which we know that Bach primarily used his toes. So the first of these is one of Bach's pupils in Weimar was Johann Tobias Krebs. When Bach was teaching somebody to be a church musician, he was teaching both composition and improvisation and organ playing and everything else all at the same time. He had a very integrated view of church music, as people did indeed at the time. And Krebs was making copies of Bach's Orgelbüchlein, which was a collection intended for exactly those purposes, to teach those things. Into those copies which Krebs made, he wrote, amongst other things, pedal indications. And we can be pretty sure from that context that this is what Bach was telling him to do. And so we really have a clear view, rather rare view of what Bach was saying to a pupil about how to pedal. And these pedal indications are left foot and right foot. There is no indication of toes and heels. And indeed, where it's not possible to play alternate toes, he is proposing to move the foot. So we have two notes in succession with the same foot, which again are between the beats, just as we were saying with the fingering about putting a strong finger onto a strong beat. So too in the pedaling, we can move the foot position between the beats seemingly with impunity. So there's the first piece of evidence, if you like, of using toes and alternate feet. And secondly, that idea is really confirmed if we look through Bach's organ music and look at his pedal parts, overwhelmingly the shortest note values, usually the semiquavers, are written in such a way that you can play them with alternate toes, whereas the slightly longer note values, the quavers and the crotchets in general, aren't necessarily so, but where you can always play them in just that same way that Krebs notated, with moving the foot from one position to another. So pure analysis of the pedal parts again suggests that Bach was thinking alternate feet. And thirdly, a bit of eyewitness evidence. Carl Christian Kegel, in his Orgelschule of 1830, which is long after Bach's time, of course, writes that Kegel's teacher, Thomas Kittel, who was one of Bach's last pupils, said of Bach that Bach played using his toes, in contrast to the new way of playing at Kegel's time in the 1830s. Well, that's a fairly good line of evidence insofar as that goes. But what it doesn't really tell us is, did Bach really never use anything else? And I think that Bach was known as, well, not necessarily as a rule breaker, but certainly as an innovator. And I really get the impression that Bach would have used his knees, if need be, to achieve the result that he wanted. So I'm quite sure that Bach could have used the odd heel here and there, and that would not be excluded by that comment that Bach used his toes. It doesn't say that Bach never pressed a single pedal with a heel, ever. But that obviously leaves one question, which is exactly the same question that we had with fingering, which is, do we need to do the same? And there are two ways of looking at it. We can say, on the one hand, well, playing with alternate toes predominantly, nearly exclusively, is going to be a more authentic way of pedaling. It's going to improve your pedal technique. The other way of looking at it is to say that many people have learnt to play using toes and heels, play perfectly happily using toes and heels, and would play unnaturally without heels. And so if it's possible to play properly with good articulation using toes and heels, then insisting on using toes only would be like insisting on wearing an 18th century costume while playing. So that's something you have to reach your own decision about. So our next section deals with ornaments. What are ornaments actually for? What is their purpose? Well, I think that they can have a number of different purposes, including and not necessarily limited to. First of all, they can make a slow melodic line more interesting and more fluid. Secondly, they can heighten attention to one particular note or draw attention to one particular note. And thirdly, they can signal the approach of some important structural event, like a trill before a cadence, for example. And fourthly, they can make a repeat varied. In other words, there's any number of different things. It's rather like physical ornaments on a shelf. You might have them there to make the shelf look less boring, to make a space more interesting, or because they are things which you have a particular affection for, or because they are things of beauty in their own right. But whatever the reason for having a physical ornament on a shelf is, it should never look out of place. It shouldn't look as though it's been accidentally left there instead of being tidied away. And in just the same way, an ornament in music should never sound like it's an extraneous thing which has just been put in because it says in the music, there should be an ornament here. So musical ornaments don't change the melody or become part of the melody. They are essentially rhythmic, not melodic things in terms of the variety that they are adding. So an ornament always has to sound spontaneous, it has to sound unforced and natural, but at the same time to sound as though it does actually belong there. And that really is the big problem with ornaments. You can get these tables of ornaments. Bach, indeed, wrote one for his son to explain what the various signs mean. But at the same time, as soon as you write an ornament down in notes, you kill it and it stops being an ornament. And that's why composers don't write out the notes. It's not just to save space, it's because an ornament is not identified with an exact succession of notes. It's going to vary according to the speed that you're playing it at, according to the acoustics, according to the way in which you're playing the music. It's got to sound, as I say, rather improvised. And if you write down a succession of notes, that is not an ornament. The good thing with tables of ornaments, with Bach's table, for example, is that we simply know the general shape that each sign represents. And so we don't need to get into a flap about what the ornaments mean, but Bach's table just gives us general pointers and doesn't give us a specific answer for every situation. One specific question which does crop up very, very often with ornaments concerns trills, and which note do we start a trill on? And there is a short answer to that, which is a Bach trill starts on the note diatonically above the main note. But even that is an answer with problems. We can be fairly sure of it as a standard answer, amongst other things, because, again, just as with fingering and with pedalling, we can look at tutor books of the 1830s, which compare the new system, which was to start trills on the main note, with the old traditional system of starting notes on the note above the main note. In addition, we get things like Bach's Explication, which we've just seen, and he notates it in that particular way. And therefore, if you look at a sort of handbook on playing 18th century music, you will almost always be told that a trill always starts on the note above. And that's a very good general rule. But there is another school of thought, and one of its main proponents was the German theorist Friedrich Neumann, which says that Bach's Explication and all the other indicators are very unnuanced. They really can't take account of all possible circumstances. And there are a number of occasions where starting a trill on the note above results in, for example, parallel fifths or parallel octaves, or other rhythmic or harmonic consequences that Bach would not have contemplated. And so therefore that there are circumstances in which it's better to start on the main note. And there again, although Bach writes in his Explication quite clearly, it's not nevertheless the case that Bach's treatment of ornaments would be different when he was 20 from when he was 40, from when he was 60, and whether he was playing German or French or Italian music, because they're all rather different. And so I think that, again, Bach would not have felt restricted by a particular set of rules. So just to illustrate one of the simpler problems, we can look at a trill in a descending scale. Here we can see such an example, and there are three ways of dealing with it. We can start from the upper auxiliary anyway, even though it means repeating the note you've just played, or you can start from the upper auxiliary but tied over from the preceding note, or you can start from the main note. And we're not going to reach any firm conclusions here, so just take those three possibilities away with you. I think that for myself, how I would approach it depends on the speed of the scale and on the circumstances. What I mean by that is, if I was playing a slow piece, especially a piece with a sort of sighing figuration, then I would always tie the note over and allow it to fall into the trill. If, on the other hand, it is very fast, there isn't going to be time either to repeat the note, which is going to be fussy, or to tie it over, which isn't going to be possible. And I would start it then on the main note. But if the piece is in a consciously old-fashioned idiom and perhaps slow note values, so a sort of canzona or something of that kind, then I'd be tempted to repeat the note and start on the note above. So 3 different solutions depending entirely on the context. Now, I said that ornaments should sound natural and unforced. How do we actually achieve that when we're learning? We hear sometimes that you should learn a piece without the ornaments and then add the ornaments in later. And there is a good argument for that, because we should be able to project the melodic lines and to get the piece to flow in a good way without having ornaments in the way. But there is also the problem then that ornaments should become part of the texture, shouldn't sound as though they've been added in afterwards. When we talk a little bit about learning, we'll talk about learning from the end and learning only as far as you can actually play. If you follow that particular system, you can put the ornaments in at the time without any particular difficulty, which allows you then to learn the piece with the ornaments in place, which is going to make them possibly sound more natural and unforced. So I would tend to go for a system of learning in an appropriate way, including the ornaments more or less from the beginning. Of course, there's no reason not to practice a phrase with and without an ornament alternately, so that we get that sense of flow and the sense of integration. And a final question, should we add extra ornaments to the music? And that really, again, depends a little bit on the context. We can look back at what we said about what ornaments are for. So there are certain kinds of ornaments which are habitual ornaments. So things like a trill just before a cadence, for example. There was an expectation that they would be there to such an extent that a composer generally wouldn't even bother writing it, but wouldn't imagine that anybody would play a cadence without a trill before it. On the other hand, sometimes Bach writes in a very dense notation of ornaments, and it's very plain that he has written in exactly what he wants. So we really need to judge it from the situation. And there again, an ornament, if it is to be improvisational, if it is to be natural, is going to arise as an interaction with the acoustic, with the instrument, with the feelings of the moment. And so it is very natural that sometimes we will put in an ornament and sometimes we won't. As I said, that there are various reasons for having an ornament, including the practice of decorating repeats, and there it will generally be appropriate to add additional ornaments irrespective in a repeat. And we talked a little bit about that curious case of Ich ruf zu dir, where Bach has missed out the ornaments because he didn't have space to write them in. And there again, it's one of those situations where we're going to add in the missing ornaments, which are clearly meant to be there. Our next topic is what kind of organ, and registration as well. You know, when I was making the series on Orgelbüchlein, I used about a dozen different instruments in Norway and Germany mostly. And these all had various things in common. They were all mechanical action instruments. They all had a tonal design that Bach would have recognized. They were all lovely instruments in their own ways. I used a one-manual instrument, that was the 18th century organ in Wesenberg, a number of two-manual instruments, including this one here, in my home church in Bjerkreim, and one or two three-manual instruments. But they all had these things in common, and they were all gorgeous instruments. Now, that is a real luxury situation which we don't always have. We sometimes are faced with a really unsuitable organ, perhaps an organ with a tonal design that does not represent the 18th century, and maybe even an action that appears to feature sponge budding as part of its mechanism, that really doesn't feel right. What do we do then? Should we actually play Bach on it? Well, I tend to think that Bach is very resilient. We can just look at what the King singers did to Bach in Leipzig that time, or the Swingle singers before that, or various electronic bands have done to Bach over the ages. And Bach survives it, and brilliantly. And I think that usually we can put something across that is going to express something of the beauty of Bach, even where the organ is unsuitable. The important thing in those circumstances is not to try to make the organ do something that it can't. So pulling out super octave couplers and the spikiest possible registrations is not going to make a dull romantic organ sound like a Baroque organ. It's rather important to play deliberately to the strengths of an organ, even if it doesn't have very many, rather than trying deliberately to point out that this organ is really unsuitable. We can usually make the best of what we've got. It's very rare that Bach actually specifies anything about registration, and when he does, he's generally fairly cryptic. Of dynamic markings, he uses F and P mostly, and even those not very often. He occasionally gives directions for different manuals, often Oberwerk and Rückpositiv. Very occasionally he specifies pitches of stops, and that's quite an important point there, that where he writes, for example, an 8-foot, he is meaning this is sounding at 8-foot pitch in relation to the notes on the page. So predominantly 8-foot. Doesn't mean that you can't have an 8-foot principal and a 4-foot flute or something like that. Similarly, where he writes in the pedals 8-foot for a chorale melody, quite often it's actually impossible to play what he has written on any 18th century organ because it will end up being too high on the pedal board. What he is saying there is 8-foot in relation to those notes. So if you have, for example, a 4-foot reed, you can play it an octave lower. So we can take a certain freedom in relation to his 8-foot and 4-foot directions, provided that the actual sounding pitch is predominantly the pitch which he has notated. Well, we're getting towards the end. Tempo is the next big question. Wouldn't it be great if we could have a recording of Bach playing so that we would know exactly what speed he played various pieces at? But even if we did, that wouldn't be a universal answer, because obviously we play at a speed which is appropriate to the instrument, to the building, and to the situation that we're playing in. So there is never going to be anything like an exact number that we can put on tempo. Bach did not believe really in writing tempo indications, in particular in the chorale preludes. I think that there are only 6 or 7 chorale preludes that he wrote which have any kind of tempo indication at all. There are 4 in Orgelbüchlein, 3 of them are adagio, 1 is largo, and 1, I think, of the Leipzig 18 has an adagio marking, and 1 of the Neumeister chorales does. Offhand, I can only think of 1 of the so-called miscellaneous chorale preludes, and none at all of the Schübler or the Klavierübung Part 3. So half a dozen chorale preludes have tempo indications. All of them but 1 are adagio and 1 is largo. So no indications of fast tempi at all. Why is that? Well, we can argue that Bach was known for playing at a fairly brisk tempo. Any comments, which there are, suggest that he did so. In general, 18th century tempi were quite brisk, so far as we can tell. In one or two cases, there have been timings of movements which have survived, and they suggest quite a fast tempo. There's a bit of evidence from barrel organs and other kinds of things, which are the closest thing we can get to a recording, which again suggest that people certainly didn't hang about. And from everything which we can understand, tempi in 18th century music was not substantially slower than we would take it today. So why did Bach not write fast tempo markings? Well, perhaps because he took it for granted that as a rule you would play fast unless you had a particular marking which said to really take it easy. In one sense, neither adagio nor largo, incidentally, are tempo markings. Adagio means adagio, which means take it easy. Largo, well, there are a lot of interpretations of what largo means, but it seems to have indicated that we put a slight weight on each note, which makes it a little bit more ponderous. Neither, technically speaking, are therefore tempo markings, but they do indicate that we slow things down a bit. But on the whole, Bach seems to have expected us to know automatically the right speed on the basis of the chorale itself and of the texture of the chorale prelude. One of the few really absolutes which we have to guide us is what's called harmonic rhythm. That's the rate at which the harmonies themselves are changing. That's not the same as the rate of the notes themselves. We need to do a little bit of harmonic analysis. Essentially, if the harmonies change once a bar, then we can play at a rather faster tempo than if the harmonies are changing every quaver, because then the harmonies are so complicated that the ear takes a little bit of time to recognize what's going on, and therefore we have to slow the tempo down. So harmonic rhythm is a really good tool for understanding the correct tempo for a piece of music. But it does just require a little bit of harmonic analysis, a little bit of thinking. But essentially, we're always going to be walking that rather fine line between projecting the chorale melody, getting the thing to flow in an appropriate way, but not rushing the figuration. At the same time, obviously, tempo is not an absolute. We can't put a number on it because it's always going to depend on the building, on the acoustic, and on the circumstances, and even on what we are trying to put across on that particular day. How do we learn a piece of music? I did a whole episode on this in the Orgelbüchlein series, the episode on Vaterunser, and I'm not going to repeat what I said then. Essentially, just as a one-line summary, what I said is that when we're learning, if we start from the beginning and try to get as far as we can and then stop and go back to the beginning again and try and get a little bit further and a little bit further, we're not only wasting a huge amount of time, but we are also learning mistakes. And we're setting ourselves up to fail by always failing to get to the end. And so we're creating a situation in which we are making ourselves nervous of playing the piece because we know that we're going to play it wrong, because we always have. And so what I proposed there was starting at the very end of a piece, start with the final chord and work our way towards it increasingly each time, so that all the time we can play successfully to the end of the piece. And that way we learn where the music is going, and we learn that we can do it successfully. So we are setting ourselves up to succeed. But go away and watch the episode on Vaterunser from the Orgelbüchlein, and that explains my thinking a little bit more there. So, some conclusions. First of all, how do you make a performance really stand out? How do you make it really special? It can be tempting to go in for some exotic registration or some excessive tempo to make ourselves stand out from the crowd. We don't need to do that for a number of reasons. First of all, it is difficult enough to get a performance to sound just right. And if we do that, then it is going to be extraordinary and special. But also, the person who's listening hasn't heard the piece probably as often as you have, and therefore doesn't need the performance to be different. We're trying to put the music across in a way which will appeal to somebody who hasn't heard it very often before. Or if the person has heard it a lot, then that implies that they know the music so well that they're going to appreciate the qualities of what you're doing. When Bach was teaching, he was teaching how to create a chorale prelude as well as how to perform a chorale prelude. And that's a good way of thinking to bring to it ourselves, that we are thinking in terms of the chorale, we're thinking in terms of how this chorale prelude is putting the music across, how it's functioning. And if we do that, then we will be projecting the music in a really good way. It's also terribly important to think about the music rather than the organ music. How would a string player, how would a woodwind player be playing this? What works musically aside from the organ itself? As organists, we sometimes get rather hung up in the instrument, and that produces a style of playing that isn't necessarily the most musical. And finally, just enjoy it. If you really love the music, if you're passionate about the music that you're playing and you really want to put that across to the listener, then it will come across as a wonderful piece of music.